本期视频是油管博主亚历山大近日一期直播的节选。视频中，他谈到美国已经不可救药地走上发动制裁战的不归路，而他们对俄东大经济规模的严重误判，以及西方各国对美国的盲从，会最终让欧洲人为此付出沉重的代价。我们看看他是怎么说的吧。
They're saying that since Russia is now a war economy, any financial institution anywhere in the world that has dealings with the Russians in any form on any issue, even if it's only, for example, to provide financing for a export of, shall we say, mattresses, bed mattresses to Russia, they run the risk of being sanctioned because they are supporting the Russian war economy. So describe the entire Russian economy as a war economy, and you can accordingly impose sanctions on anybody who does any trade with the Russians at all. First and foremost, financial institutions. Now, whose financial institutions are the Americans targeting? Well, it's not difficult. A couple of weeks ago, we had Secretary of State Tony Blinken coming to Beijing, warning the Chinese that if they continued in their to conduct relations with China, with Russia, economic relations with Russia, if they continue to conduct their trade with the Russians, then the US would start to sanction Chinese banks. And of course, it is Chinese banks that the US is now targeting. And the key thing to understand is that the United States knows perfectly well that the Chinese are not going to curtail their economic and trading relationship with the Russians. For China, it is a strategic priority. The Chinese are fully aware of American plans to intensify the economic blockade, as the Chinese would see it, against them. Chinese are also aware of American plans to begin co-production of missiles and other equipment with Japan. So from the Chinese point of view, they need allies. They need people at their rear who can supply them with raw materials and the food and agricultural products that they need to withstand what might very well turn out to be, and where almost certainly would turn out to be, ultimately, an American siege. So they're not going to curtail their economic relations with the Russians. They have, in fact, repeatedly said as much. And that, of course, brings us to what these sanctions really are about. They are not anti-Russian sanctions. They are anti-Chinese sanctions. The United States does not want to impose, for the moment, sanctions on China openly, because that would be an admission, a public admission, that the relationship between the United States and China has collapsed, and that the two countries are in a hostile situation as one against the other. That might not be popular with many business people in the United States, and it would be very unpopular with many business people in Europe who are showing increasing frustration of the whole direction of Western policy. So the United States is now preparing to start sanctioning Chinese banks and financial institutions. It is intending to start a sanctions war against China, but it is masking these sanctions by pretending that they're not actually anti-Chinese sanctions at all, which they self-evidently are. It is going to pretend that they are anti-Russian sanctions. This is what this whole thing is ultimately all about. The Chinese know it. The world outside the West can see it too. We are starting to see how the sanctions war that the United States initiated is getting further and further out of control. And in time, we're going to see comprehensive American sanctions against China, just as we're seeing comprehensive American sanctions against Russia. They will take a different form. They will initially target China's financial services industry rather than Chinese trade in goods. But we're now firmly on that sanctions escalator, and it has gone up a massive rung. And people should understand that there is no end point to this, just as the only end point with Russia was a complete cut-off of the Russian economy from the Western economy. If the political leadership in Washington does not change, if the policies that are conducted by the US government do not change, we are going to end up eventually in that same position with China too. Now, that will not be good for the US economy, which relies heavily on cheap Chinese goods, and it will probably increase inflationary pressures over time in the United States, but it is going to be devastating for the European economies as well. Now, you might have expected the European leaders to be unhappy about this, to have publicly pushed back against it, to have criticised the Biden administration for doing it, for calling in the Americans and saying to them, this goes altogether too far, we can't support this. But no, just as is happening now with this latest $50 billion loan, which is going to be ultimately the Europeans that are going to repay. So it is going to be the Europeans who are going to pay the biggest price for this sanctions war that the Americans are planning ultimately to wage against China as well. Now, the other side, of course, is starting to respond. We're told that, well, there's just been a apparently very successful BRICS foreign ministers meeting in Russia. We're going to have, apparently the work is now underway for the BRICS summit, which is pending in Kazan in September. Vladimir Putin has said that the Russians and the Chinese and the other BRICS states are now working hard on developing their own financial architecture to facilitate mutual trade. We've seen how Saudi Arabia apparently is now taking further steps to edge away from exclusive use of the dollar in its oil trade. It's not to say that the Saudis aren't going to continue to accept dollars. They will. But they're starting to slowly, gradually shift away from dollars, or at least the exclusive use of the dollar as well. And I'm going to say the ultimate point of all of this, given the balance of economic power that exists in the world now, is that we're going to see not China, the BRICS, pushed back, isolated, forced into economic stagnation. That will be what will happen to the Americans and to the Europeans instead. I've discussed recently how I think that the Western leaders still understand the economic balance in the world on the basis of nominal GDP, as opposed to GDP recalculated on the basis of purchasing power parity. We've seen that they have massively, gravely, catastrophically misjudged the size of the Russian economy. They thought it might have been perhaps a fifth of its true size because they were working with nominal GDP rather than with actual purchasing power parity GDP. They're making the same miscalculation about China as well, in my opinion. They still believe that the US has the bigger economy than China does, even though the World Bank says that on a purchasing power parity basis, China's economy stands at $35 trillion, as opposed to the US economy, which stands at just $27 trillion. My own view is that the gap is greater, just as I happen to believe that, just as I've long believed, that Western GDP calculations of the Russian economy greatly understated the true size of the Russian economy. I've been arguing this for years, and I feel that I've now been vindicated on this very issue. So it seems to me that the truth is the same with China. I happen to believe that China's true GDP level is not $35 trillion, as the World Bank estimates. I think it is significantly bigger than this, though as I do not know the Chinese economy as well as I do the Russian, I'm not going to try to even guess its true size. But if the Chinese economy, in terms of overall economic activity, is now twice the size of the American one, I, for one, would not be surprised. One might have expected that the failure of the Russian sanctions would have told them that things in the world are different from the way they thought they were. One might have expected that the revelations about the true size of the Russian economy was a warning. I doubt that they have learnt anything from this because, of course, they're not in the same world of facts that people like myself are in. So they don't just make the same mistakes again and again. They make them on an ever bigger scale. And as for the Europeans, as we've seen with the $50 billion loan to Ukraine, and as we're going to very soon see with the American sanctions against the Chinese banks, well, there's a sucker every time, and this time it is them.